Friends, it's a pleasure again to be with you. And if you look around, you'll see I'm sitting right where I was the last time. I told you the story about how the park came to be here. And now I'm going to talk about things that used to be around the park. I'm sure I could think of a lot of things that were around the park here, but I've got a story or two about happenings around here, and that might be of interest to you. One first thing I'll tell you, that on the east side of this park runs 5th Street. That used to be solid houses, of course not on the park side, but across the street from the park. Solid houses. And then on the next block, which is now a parking lot for the medicine factory up here, that was solid house. Wasn't a spot, wasn't a lot along that block, but what there was a house in it. Bristol was mostly inward then. Now we've got all kinds of developments, all kinds of additions and so on way out in the country, miles out in the country, some of them. But at that time, most of Bristol was pretty compact. Along that line, downtown was where it was. That's where downtown. It was business, all business. We didn't have any box stores at that time when I came here in 1953. And business was good downtown. It's just like a constant mall down there, people walking up and down the streets. But I happened, my first time in Bristol was, first year or two, was spent on 4th Street. And I had occasion to walk up this way pretty many times. I found this park here. And I had occasion to know some people who lived right inside of it. And I know some stories about those people. At one point, I lived more or less. I didn't have a home of my own, but I had 3 old cousins who lived at 518 Alabama, just 3 houses up the street. And they gave me a home there for many times. I'd go out and work somewhere else a while and come back to town, and they'd always find a place for me to stay in that home. The house has 15 rooms, and I've slept in 11 of them, including the kitchen, and including one in the basement. They would always find a room for me when I came back to town. And one time I did sleep in the kitchen on a cot. Well, there's a boarding house, and the dear old lady had to get up at 4 o'clock to start cooking for the early boarders, so I had to get up and get out of the kitchen so she could go ahead with her breakfast. Well, that's one little incident I remember. I can see the chimney of the house now from where I'm sitting right here. They're long gone, passed on, lived to be nearly 100, but both of them, but they're gone now. And the old house still stands. I go by there many a time with the pleasant thoughts of it. House of the 3 sisters. Now, one of the sisters died at the age of 69, but I, to this day, still call it the House of 3 Sisters. From where I sit, I can see a professional office. And the gentleman is well educated, naturally has to be in his profession, but he firmly believes in ghosts. And that house is supposed to be haunted. Well, I never did see anything there, but he swears that it is haunted. I don't try to contradict him because I don't know, but I do know he's a solid man and a well-educated man, but he still swears that the house is haunted. That's one thing I think about as I look around. Then I look up toward the medicine plant. You know, that started like from a little acorn, but it sure grew into a big oak. It started in a cubby hole, just a little hole in the wall downtown, and one can see what it grew into. I remember when one big addition was built on it. In fact, I was living at 518 Alabama then, and from my bedroom I could look up and see them putting the window arches in place up on the big part of the building. Well, it's still there, but it's changed hands and changed names. I don't really know what the name of it is now. But many a person worked there, many a person made their living there, and I know a lot of them that did. The founder of it, Mr. Massengill, had died just before I came here, but he left a great heritage to Bristol. His widow had also passed on when I came here, but I heard a lot speaking about him. And to you who might be interested, the old Massengill home on Holston Avenue is being given a thorough restoration. They're really making a fine place out of it again. And I think it's going to be a bed and breakfast, if I hear right. Well, it's gone now, but there used to be a brick house right across from the park here, facing 5th Street, that we all call the Pink House. The reason it got that name was because somebody along the way decided they wanted to paint that brick house pink. That's an unusual color for a house. But notwithstanding, it has a great past, had a great past. It was built by a jeweler who came here from England. He was a great watchmaker, clock repairman, and so on. And he was the one that built the house. He first had a store down in the 400 block of State Street. And he had a son who also followed in the business. And in time, he made enough money that he wanted to build a fine house. So he bought a choice lot right across from the park here and built a brick house. It was an English cottage, had a basement that was actually rooms, but the main building was up high. Had to go up high steps to get into it. Originally it was trimmed with a gingerbread, Victorian gingerbread trim. You know, we cooked lumber into all kinds of curlicues and so on. And it was unusually well decorated that way. Well, this man decided to go on to Jonesboro, and so he sold the house to Dr. A.M. Carter's wife, and it was well known as the Carter home until Mrs. Carter died in 1936, I believe, or 7. But that wasn't what I started to tell about the house. When this man was having it built, the original owner, he hired a Mr. James P. Lewis to build it. James P. Lewis was a great bricklayer, one of the kingpin bricklayers of Bristol. He knew his art. They said he could look all around while he's laying brick and still lay them perfectly. Well, he lived just back of it on 4th Street, I believe. Anyway, very near that place. And he would work on it, walk across there to his home, and then come back next day to work on the building. Mr. Lewis was a married man and had only one child, a little daughter named Rebecca. And she was something like 4 or 5 years old. Well, she loved her daddy. He told later how she'd always come halfway across the block to run to meet him when she saw him coming home from work. She was his pride and joy. He loved that child so well. Up in East Hill today, cemetery, you can see a pretty nice stone, a small obelisk, to James P. Lewis, bricklayer, contractor. Nearby, you'll see a little stone with Rebecca on it. Rebecca was the pride and joy of his life. When she was about 5 years old, she took bad sick. I don't know what it was, but there was a terrible infant and child mortality in the town at that time. And she became mortally ill. Doctors did what they could. He had 2 or 3 doctors with her, trying to save her, but she died. He was devastated. He never was the same man afterward. He became severely depressed, but of course, he was wise enough to try to keep on working. There were nights when he couldn't sleep for thinking about the great tragedy that had come into his life. His wife did everything she could to reason with him and so on. She was a pretty level-headed woman, but he just wouldn't be comforted. No one could comfort him. Well, it came a time when the moon was real bright, and he couldn't sleep, and so he came to where his job was, and he laid brick by moonlight. Now you talk about moonlighting today, that's what he was doing. But the miracle of it was, seemingly, that he could lay brick in the dark, or at least by moonlight, and old-timers talked about that for years here. They said that you couldn't tell the part of the wall he built in the darkness of night or in the moonlight. Of course, he would actually work when it's dark, feeling his way. And one old gentleman who was still living when I came here remembered him and remembered the situation well. And he said that this fella worked so well that you couldn't tell where he worked at night or daytime. Well, that speaks well for him. He lived on 2 or 3 years, but finally died, people said, of a broken heart. And I guess that's what really happened. That can happen, you know. So he and little Rebecca are sleeping in East Hill now, but his wife's not there. I don't know what happened to her. She probably remarried maybe and moved away from town. That's very possible that could have happened. Another house stood right by it, a little wood cottage. It too has a past and a story. I will try to tell you that story. A man named A.C. Smith came here from Richmond, became associate editor of the Bristol News, and finally the editor of the Bristol News. And he was a well-loved citizen in town. One night, old Dr. M.M. Butler was riding home from work, and he rode by on his way to his home over on Anderson Street, and he saw smoke coming from the Smith house. And he also saw that there was flames beginning to come out of the roof. So he knew the house was on fire. And so he rode up with his horse to the house and warned the people, and so he saved their lives, actually, probably, by sounding the alarm and telling them that the house was on fire. Well, I tell this story to illustrate a point. Probably that family would have perished had not Dr. Butler been late in riding home from his calls he'd making in the country somewhere. And what the gist of the thing, the real story though, is what follows. I write a lot about the evils of Bristol, wickedness that was here in early days, and it was. It was a rough, wild, and woolly town. But I overcame that with a chapter in my book, Pioneers in Paradise, called Hearts of Gold. Well, Editor Fowler, the main editor of the Bristol News, started a campaign to get materials, free labor, and so on to finish to build a house for him. They built him a nice little cottage, and that cottage stood until just 4 or 5 years ago. We call it the Love Cottage because love built it. People loved him and built for him. Well, anyway, the house is gone now, but the story lingers on. One more little tale. I remember when this block here south of the park was all solid building. There's one on it left yet. But there were 3 or 4 big 2-story houses, fine houses, up through there. And as would happen, they were torn down, of course, to make a parking lot. But before that happened, those very fine houses became very run down, badly run down, turned into apartments. Well, I knew a young man that was courting a girl there in one of the shed apartments in one of those houses. I think lived with her mother there, maybe a widowed mother. And they were sitting in the living room of a night talking and courting, you know. And he came to the place where he wanted to ask her to marry him. And he was beginning his talk. He's beginning to make his deal, try to get her to marry him. And he said just as he got down about ready to ask her to marry him, 2 big rats ran through the room, and she jumped up and hollered. she was scared to death of rats. She jumped up and hollered and jumped on the back of the couch, and he kind of laughed at her, and that made her mad, and she told him to go home and never come back. So he always said rats ruined his wedding. He was ready to pop the question. 2 rats ran through the room. She was hollering for him to kill them, and instead he's just standing there laughing at her. And boy, she told him to get and never come back. So that ended his marriage plans. Many other stories I could tell you just simply by looking around here and thinking what's happening in this area. But I think the time has left me, so I'll say until we meet again, may the best in life be yours.